Good evening. Am I on? Yeah, all right, thank you. You can't tell from up here, so thank you. Again, good evening. My name is Kevin Pybus. I'm a professor in the Political Science Department. I am the Public Affairs Fellow this year, which means that I have chaired a committee that has put this conference on. I'm going to be introducing an individual in a moment who will introduce our speaker, but I have an announcement. Many of you may have already heard, but our plenary speaker tomorrow noon has had to cancel, J.D. Vance. A family emergency arose, and so he will not be with us tomorrow. We're already in the works of rescheduling that. When that happens, it will be widely and loudly advertised, but so if you haven't gotten the word, there will be no J.D. Vance plenary talk tomorrow. So we hope the best for what's going on with his family, but he had no choice but to return home. So with that, I want to call up Sam Siebert, the president of the Student Activities Council, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Hi, everybody. My name's Sam Siebert. I'm the president of the Student Activities Council, like Professor Pybus just said. We are a sponsor of tonight's lecture. So tonight we have Sonja Lyubomirsky. She's a professor of psychology at the University of California, Riverside, and the author of The How of Happiness and the Myths of Happiness, translated in 23 and 16 languages, respectively. Her research on the possibility of lastingly increasing happiness has been honored, just to count a few, with fellow status from 3 different scientific societies, 2 John Templeton Foundation grants, and a Templeton Positive Psychology Prize, among others. Lyubomirsky, who received her bachelor's degree summa cum laude from Harvard University and her doctorate in social psychology from Stanford University, will be lecturing this evening on the how of happiness, the ways small activities and practices like gratitude and kindness can help us become happier and more flourishing individuals. So please help me in giving a warm Missouri State welcome to Dr. Sonja Lyubomirsky.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for that lovely introduction. My first time in Springfield, Missouri, and I didn't know you have the big sky here. It's really gorgeous here. I'm really enjoying that. And it's a very cool theme for this conference. I wish I could see many of the talks that are presented here. So I'll be talking today about happiness. My book is called, well, one of my books is called The How of Happiness. It should be here. So I'll be referring to it throughout the talk. And these are my collaborators, my graduate students, and sort of fellow researchers that I do my research with. So I hope that you will find the topic that I'm going to talk about today interesting and valuable for your work or for your personal lives. It is generally an inherently interesting topic, happiness. I mean, it's so interesting that I tend not to tell like people who sit next to me on airplanes, what I study if I don't want to talk the whole time about my work. So let me start by backtracking a little back through history. We'll go to World War II. Okay, so during the Second World War, aviation experts used a lot of energy and resources in studying airplanes or military planes that went down. And one day somebody asked, why don't we study the planes that stay up in the air? And I think that's a really good kind of metaphor for the work that I do in the field of what we call well-being science. We study why happy people are happy, why healthy people are healthy, why successful people are successful. So that's what we'll talk about today. So most people in the world say they want to be happy. Now, you might think that there are cultural differences, right? In some cultures, like in some Asian cultures, it might be perceived as kind of arrogant or selfish or too kind of self-focused to focus on your own happiness. But researchers actually have gone around the world and they've asked people in all different countries, what are your most important goals in life? So I'm going to show you some data. Start off with some data here on sort of how important is happiness to you on a scale of 1 to 7. And I've just kind of almost randomly chosen 6 countries to show you. United States, Greece, Germany, South Africa, China, Argentina, so different continents, very different cultures. So in the US, people rate happiness very important, like a 6.6 on a 7-point scale, right? Almost a 7. But when you look at other cultures, they also rate happiness really, really important. Now, there actually are some significant differences in that graph. And so people living in Germany and China actually rate happiness a little significantly less important, closer to a 6 out of 7, but still, still pretty high, right? Still very high. So pretty much everywhere that researchers have looked at, people say that happiness is important. I was actually born in Russia. I came here when I was almost 10 years old. And in Russia, people talk about the importance of suffering, that you're supposed to suffer like to gain salvation in the next life or to build character. And so there's a culture that doesn't really seem to value happiness. But even there, if you ask parents what they want most for their children, they will say, oh, I want my children to be happy, right? So maybe it depends on how you ask the question. And so people around the world do sort of claim that they want to be happy, partly why we have this sort of industry, a whole happiness industry. But is happiness good for you, right? So I think there's some ideas out in the culture that people who are happy are kind of selfish, and happiness is about pleasure, that people kind of want to be happy because they want to feel good. And so one question that I've been interested in exploring with my colleagues is happiness more than just about feeling good? Is it more than about pleasure? And it certainly is. So we've done some reviews of the literature. So I'm going to show you, this is what's called a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is like an analysis of many analyses, analysis of many studies, a study of studies. And so we find that people who are happy are more productive at work, and they're more creative. Thank you. And people who are happy are, this might be a little slow. Let me see if this works better. They make more money and have superior jobs. So there are 3 kinds of studies that go into this meta-analysis: longitudinal studies, correlational studies, and experiments. And of course, the causal arrow goes both directions, right? So we know that having money makes people happy. Not as much as you think, but it does. But then if you're a happy person, you will actually make more money. So relevant to the college students here in this room, one study showed that if you are happier in college when you're 19 years old, you will have a higher income at age 37. Now, it's a correlation, and there could be lots of reasons for that. And that actually was that study found that controlling for parental income. Happier people are better leaders and negotiators. They're more likely to get married, have better marriages, less likely to get divorced. They have more friends. So again, going back to marriage, being married makes people happy, but if you're a happier person, you're more likely to attract someone who wants to marry you. Happier people also are healthier. They live longer. They have stronger immune systems. And kind of contrary to, I think, some stereotypes that happier people are more selfish, actually, it turns out that people who are sad and depressed are sort of, quote, more selfish, because when you are sad, you can sort of think of it as it's adaptive to focus on yourself and to sort of think about what is the problem, what do I need to do? When you're happy, in a sense, you have the luxury not to focus on yourself, but to focus on others. So happier people actually are more generous, contribute more money to charity, leave bigger tips in restaurants than people who are unhappy. And happier people also show more resilience under adversity, under stress, or after trauma. And because these findings I think are so important, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them. I'm going to tell you about some studies that have been done to show these relationships. So starting with, not sure if I figured this out. Okay, so starting with health, we'll look at whether sort of evidence that shows that people who are happier are healthier. And so there are a lot of longitudinal studies in this area. And what longitudinal studies do is they measure someone's happiness at time 1. So if you were all in this study, I could measure all of your happiness by giving you a questionnaire and asking you, how often do you experience positive emotions? How satisfied are you with your life, et cetera? And then I will follow you through time to see how healthy you are. Do you have much pain? Have you had a heart attack? Do you have diabetes? How often do you get colds? And so researchers do that across time. And so they found in many, many studies that people who are happy at one point in time have a lower incidence of stroke and heart disease many years later. If you have heart disease and you're happier, you're more likely to survive it up to 11 years later. If you have lung cancer, which is a much more deadly disease, you're more likely to survive it 3 years later if you're happier. Happier people are less likely to be on disability. One of the most interesting findings actually is that happier people are less likely to die in a car accident. So maybe they have less road rage, or they're more likely to wear a seatbelt, or are more focused when they drive. And happier people are less likely to die of all causes. So there are lots of mechanisms trying to understand this finding. Why is it that happiness is associated with health? Because these are all correlations. And so researchers try to kind of figure out what the key mechanisms are. And so one of the key mechanisms we think is immune function, that maybe happier people have stronger immune systems. So here's a study that's a pretty famous study. Some of you may have read about it in newspapers or magazines, and I call it the cold virus study. And here's a lovely picture of the rhinovirus, which is a cold virus. And so in this study, what researchers did is they took people and they measured their happiness, and then they gave everyone the virus, the cold virus. So it's kind of like, and I think of it as kind of like when you travel on an airplane, there are these cold viruses on airplanes, and they're there. And some people always get sick, right, when they travel, and some people rarely get sick. And so sort of what's the secret of the people who don't get sick? And so in this study, the researchers they exposed everyone to the cold virus. Directly into their nasal passages, they injected the cold virus. And you might wonder who would want to be in a study like that. Well, it turns out that the participants were compensated $800 for their participation. This was back in like 1999 or so, in $99. But they did have to kind of quarantine them. So they, like a jury is sequestered in a motel if there's a long period of deliberation. So researchers quarantined these students, or I don't think they were students, for 5 days in a motel. And because they wanted to monitor them for cold symptoms and make sure they're all kind of in the same environment, and they monitored them for a month. And what they found was that the happier volunteers were less likely to develop a cold. And when they did develop a cold, the symptoms didn't last as long. So again, everyone was exposed to the cold virus, but if you're happier, you're less likely to actually show symptoms of it. And similar studies have shown kind of similar results. So just a more recent one, the researchers had people, these are people who were getting the hepatitis B vaccination. And so happier people who got the Hep B vaccination showed a stronger immunoprotective response than those who were less happy. So again, kind of evidence, again, it's correlational evidence, but it's evidence showing that happier people might have stronger immune systems. And these findings were there even after controlling for things like age, education level, body mass index, things like that. So it wasn't the case that happier participants were just younger or weren't as overweight, things like that. Okay, so that's research on health. So let me now say a few words about productivity and creativity at work or at school, right? Is happiness important when you're a student and when you're a worker? And absolutely it is. So here's an example of a study that was done actually in California where I live. And it was done at a state agency, government agency. And researchers came to the offices of this agency, and they measured everyone's happiness. And most of the employees were male, average 45 years. And then what the researchers did is that 3.5 years later, they came back to the office, and they went to the managers or the supervisors of these employees, and they asked them, like, well, what do you think about these employees? Like, are they doing a good job? They asked them to rate the employees on sort of overall work performance, and also on sort of various dimensions, like do they offer useful ideas? Do they have high goals when they do projects? Do they work well with others? Do they pay attention to you when you give them feedback? And the general finding was, sorry, I just keep clicking, just hoping that it'll work. eventually. Okay. And the general finding was that the happier employees, the happier the employees were 3.5 years ago, right, the more highly rated they were by their supervisors. Now, this could be some kind of halo effect, right? It could be that maybe the supervisors just liked the happier employees more, and so they just rated them as better workers, even though they weren't really objectively better workers. And that's possible, and that actually is still a very important finding. Although there are other studies that show that happier salespeople, for example, actually sell more product and have more satisfied customers. And so, again, lots of studies showing that happier people sort of do better on the job. So these are all longitudinal or correlational studies. What about experimental studies? We could do studies where we try to randomly assign people to either be happy or not be happy, and then sort of see what kind of outcomes they experience. And so another study that I really like, I call the creativity study. And this study was trying to figure out if you make people happy temporarily, will they show more creativity? Now, if you were going to do an experiment and bring people into the laboratory and make them happier temporarily, how would you do it? Think about that. There's been lots of different things that researchers have tried. So, for example, often they will show funny videos, like happy video clips, movie clips, to make people happy temporarily, or play happy music. Music is actually a pretty powerful mood inducer. In this study, the researchers induced happy mood by giving people a gift. And a gift is a really reliable way to induce happy mood. And in this case, they gave people a cellophane package just like this of candy and chocolate. And so they didn't let them eat it right away. They had to wait. And they did have to exclude certain kinds of participants from the study. They excluded diabetics, as you might imagine, but they also excluded dieters, right? And you could imagine that, right, if you're on a diet, getting a gift of chocolate and candy would not actually make you happy, right? It might actually make you unhappy. And so they had only people who were not on a diet. And so we had people who got the gift and people who did not get a gift. So that was an induction of happy mood. And then they gave everyone a test of creativity. Now, it's not easy to measure creativity kind of in a laboratory situation in a half hour, but there are different sort of methods that psychologists have developed. And one of them is called the remote associates test. It was actually developed by the father of one of my colleagues, just coincidentally. And what this test does is it gives people a whole set of items. And for each item, well, for each kind of question, there are 3 words. Here's an example: crab, sauce, and pine. And you have to find a 4th word that links up with each of these 3 words to kind of create a new word. Does that make sense? There's a sort of a 4th word that you can add to each of these 3 words to create a new word in each case. Does anyone know the answer to this one? Apple. All right, so crab apple, apple sauce, and pineapple. Right, you see that? Actually, when you see it, it's like really obvious. And there's a whole bunch of questions like this. And so the idea is that when you have sort of creative and flexible thinking, you're faster at doing this kind of task, this kind of test, and you're better at it. And so what the researchers found was that the participants in the study who were put in a happy mood actually did better on this creativity test. So they actually got more of the items right. Showing that in sort of experimental evidence that if you just put someone in a good mood, they will show more creativity. And I think that's a really important finding. Some people think that temporary happy moods are not that important, right? Like if you feel happy for 5 minutes or for 20 minutes, maybe that's not so important. But it is important because even like short bursts of positive emotion or positive mood can have sort of long-term or durable consequences, right? Because imagine you're feeling happy for 15 minutes, that might make you more creative. And maybe you think of an idea at work or school, or you might smile more and someone might approach you and help you with something, or you might make a new friend and that makes you even happier. And then that makes you healthier. And those are called upward spirals, right? When one sort of good thing can lead to another. So even short bursts of positive emotion are important. Okay, so there's evidence that happiness is also associated, not just associated with, but it can actually lead to more creative thinking. And so we also know, sort of see the highlighted lines there, that happier people have more friends and they're more generous. And so one thing that my students in my laboratory want to find out is if the effect could go the other way. So if you're happier, you have more friends, but if you're more generous, but if we get people to actually act more generously, would they become happier and would they make more friends? And so we did a study, and this is actually one of the few studies that we did with kids. Most of our studies are with adults, and a lot actually are with college students. And so in this study, we went to the beautiful city of Vancouver, and we went to the Vancouver School District and did a study with 4th, 5th, and 6th graders in that city. So the average age was between 10 and 11 years old. And so what we did is a 4-week experiment or a 4-week intervention where we asked these kids to either do acts of kindness every week, do 3 acts of kindness every week for a period of 4 weeks, or in the control group, the students were asked to do what we call the whereabouts activity, where they just kept track of places that they went to, 3 places they went to every week. So, okay, so half these kids did acts of kindness, things that you don't usually do, 3 per week over the course of 4 weeks, and the other half just visited places. And I'll show you some examples of what the actual kids in the study wrote. And it's kind of cute because they're like 9, 10, 11 years old. So here's a girl who was in the acts of kindness group. And so we asked her to list the 3 acts of kindness that she did. And so you can see she wrote that she vacuumed the floor. Sorry, some of you may not see this. She cleaned the dining table. The spelling is not so great here. And my favorite was hugging my mom when she's stressed by her job. So notice that all of these acts of kindness that she did were done at home, not at school. And that's what we found, that most of the acts of kindness that these kids chose to do, they chose to do at home with their families. And here's an example of a kid. This is a boy who was in the control condition where he was asked to keep track of 3 activities that he did during the week. And so he wrote that he went to the Richmond Shopping Center, he went to do track, and the last thing it said swimming at Hillcrest. So he went swimming. And mostly these were kind of fun activities, sports, or visiting family or friends. And so actually, because they were fun activities, we didn't find any differences in happiness between those 2 groups. So both the acts of kindness group and this whereabouts group, they became happier over time. But we did find, and this is so cool, is that the kids who did acts of kindness actually became more popular with their classmates. What we did is in every classroom, we asked every kid to rate every other kid not to rate. We asked them to nominate who they wanted to be in activities with. So this kind of measure on the upper left-hand corner is a very common measure of what's called peer acceptance. And so the idea is that you write down the names of the kids in your class that you would like to spend more time with, you'd like to play with, and do activities with. So you don't you don't rate popularity, you sort of rate who you'd like to play with. And so what we found was that the kids who were in the acts of kindness group, this is a histogram that shows changes over time from before this 4-week intervention to after. Kids in the acts of kindness group, they actually got more nominations, about 1 more nomination after the study. And what's interesting, again, is that most of these acts of kindness that these kids did were done at home. So it wasn't like they were helping their classmates and the classmates liked them in return. It was like they were helping their parents and they came back into the classroom and maybe something rubbed off on them, like they seemed more confident or more positive or happier, and the kids wanted to play with them more. So I think that's a really important finding. Maybe introducing kind of acts of kindness into classrooms might increase peer acceptance, reduce bullying, maybe, probably also important to do in workplaces as well. So there's a study that we did, as I said, with kids. So basically, the question that drives our research in my laboratory at UC Riverside is, we know that happiness has all these benefits. We know that most people in the world say they want to be happier. So is it actually possible to become happier, and how can people do it? That's kind of the big question that drives our research, and how can you sustain happiness? And And there actually are some reasons to be pessimistic about whether it's even possible to become happier. And some of you might be surprised to know. You think, well, of course you can become happier. But there's research, for example, in the field of behavior genetics that shows that there's a genetic influence on our happiness. So research with identical and fraternal twins shows that identical twins are much more similar in their happiness levels than our fraternal twins. And that suggests that there is a genetic component to happiness. Now, it doesn't mean that we're fated to be whatever sort of our genetic component is. Those of us, that's actually one of my, I have 4 children, and some of them are happier than others. And so you sort of think that, they're all biological children, we raise them similar ways, but clearly some people are just born happier than others, they're naturally happier than others. So we know that to be the case, and some people are sort of pessimistic, and they take that to suggest that, well, there's nothing much we can do about happiness. I don't believe that that is true, but there certainly is truth to the fact that that happiness is partly in our genes, and it's also part of our personalities. So we know that there's something called the 5-factor model of personality, and happiness is very closely related to our personalities. And personality is something that's really stable across the lifespan, and it's hard to change. It used to be thought that you couldn't change people's personalities after age 30. That's actually not true. And there's a famous article that's literally, the title is something like, you can change people's personalities after age 30. But if happiness is part of our personality, if it's a trait, then it will be probably pretty hard to change. So that's part of the sort of sources of pessimism for like whether you can do something about happiness. And finally, there's something called hedonic adaptation that I talk a lot about in my second book called The Myths of Happiness. And so hedonic adaptation is the phenomenon that we human beings are really good at getting used to or getting accustomed to changes in our lives. And so whenever, especially good changes, so when good things happen to us, at first it makes us really happy, and then we sort of adapt, we get used to them. And so some classic examples are when we buy things or we move into, say, a nicer apartment or a nicer house. At first, it's really great, wow. And then you just get used to it, you start taking it for granted. One of the examples I like to use for my own life is I got LASIK surgery maybe 10 years ago. And I used to have just horrible vision. I was almost blind, and I hated contact lenses. They really irritated my eyes, and I hated glasses and how I looked in glasses. And you have this surgery that's like miraculous. It takes like 10 seconds, and then you have 20/20 vision. And I was so happy. And it really, when you think about, that's a huge change in your life, right? Going to like almost blind to having perfect vision. And it took me maybe 2 weeks to get totally used to my perfect vision and taking it for granted. So, and that's just one example of hundreds. So human beings are really good at taking and sort of getting used to positive changes. So if we get used to almost everything good that ever happens to us, then how can we ever become happier, right? So that's kind of the puzzle for happiness researchers. Well, I'm actually not pessimistic about change in happiness. I argue, and this is kind of my argument in a nutshell, that despite the finding that our happiness is partially influenced by genes, and despite the fact that kind of what our vision is like, or where we live, or how beautiful we are, or whether even where we're married, those things have a surprisingly small impact on our happiness levels, I should say, unless we're very poor, or we're in an abusive relationship, or if we live in a war zone. Obviously those things would make us unhappy, but for most of us here, like people in this room, our life circumstances don't affect our happiness as much as we think they would. Still, there's a large portion of happiness that's under our control that we can't change, and that's sort of what I study in my research. So I'm actually gonna skip this because we don't need to talk about it. So anyway, so the point is that a large portion of happiness is under our control, and so then how can we become happier? Sort of what do we do? Well, there are probably 100 strategies that people can use to make themselves happier. And unless you've been like living under a rock or something, or in a cave, like you would not be surprised to hear what these strategies are. So things like expressing gratitude, practicing your religion if you have one, exercising, being forgiving, investing in your relationships, helping others. Like those are all things that make people happy. And they're associated with people who are happy, right? So happy people do more of those things. And so in my lab, what we do is we actually systematically try to study these strategies in the laboratory, where we test whether if you get one group of participants to engage in one of these behaviors and you compare them with other groups, we want to see how happiness changes over time. And so what we do, we call positive interventions. And positive interventions are kind of like clinical trials. They're experiments, random controlled trials, where people are asked to change themselves in some positive way. And just like in a clinical trial, a medical researcher might be testing a new drug. And so they might wonder, like, does this drug work? So that's the first question. And then under what conditions does it work? Maybe it works for some people better than for others. What's the most optimal dosage of the drug? Those are the same kinds of questions that we ask in our own interventions. And so we've done lots of interventions. Basically, over the course of weeks or months, we ask participants to do acts of kindness, to write gratitude letters, to try to be optimistic. We compare them to other groups or conditions. And so, for example, this is one example, live your life like it's your last month. We did a study. It was actually featured on the Today Show because they thought it was really cool. We did a study at James Madison University in Virginia with students where we asked them to imagine that a month from now, you're moving away, right? Like maybe you're studying abroad or you got a job really, really far away. You went to school really far away. You're moving away a month from today. And we want you to live your life in the next month like it's your last month at that location. And it was kind of amazing. Like these students really changed their lives for that month. There's a lot of hiking in Virginia and near that university. And so they did all these hikes that they loved. They went to their favorite restaurants. They spent more time with friends and family. And so we really got them to savor their experiences more. So, and so again, the focus of my lab is sort of studying these kinds of positive activities, happiness increasing strategies to see if they work and how they work. And so I'm going to just give you some examples of the kinds of studies we do, but just really, really quickly. So for example, the very first intervention that I've ever done, we did a 6-week count your blessings study where we asked people to count their blessings. And you guys know what that means, right? Like basically keep a gratitude journal. We asked people to write down 5 things that you're grateful for over a period of 6 weeks. And, but in this study, we were interested in the importance of the right dosage of gratitude, right? So is it possible to express too much gratitude or too often or not enough gratitude? So we kind of wanted to find out what is the best dosage of gratitude. So in this study, we asked people to count their blessings either once a week, so every Sunday night over the course of 6 weeks, or 3 times a week, so every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday night. And here's what we found. Okay, so these are histograms showing changes in gratitude and changes in happiness from before to after this 6-week intervention. You see the orange bars show the participants, and these are students in this case, college students, who counted their blessings once a week. And you see that the students who counted their blessings once a week, they became more grateful over the course of those 6 weeks, and they became happier over the course of the 6 weeks. And the control group, either nothing changed or actually became less happy. And the students who count their blessings 3 times a week, there was no impact on them. And so we've been really interested in this finding that there's something about counting your blessings once a week that was special. And some people say to me, well, maybe there's something special about, like a lot of religions, people will go to church or temple like once a week to review their life. And so maybe there's something about that weekly review that's really important. And maybe if you count your blessings too much, that it becomes a chore or it loses its meaning over time. Or you can't think of more things to be grateful for, so it could actually backfire. So there's an example of the importance of dosage. So these are sort of different factors that we're looking at to see what what makes the pursuit of happiness successful? What's the secret to the best kind of strategy to make yourself happier? And so one of them is the sort of appropriate dosage. Another important thing is fit, and so we find that you have to, especially with counting blessings, like when I first learned about counting blessings, I thought it was the hokiest thing ever. Like I was like, I'm not someone who would, carry a gratitude journal around. But some people say that it's really great, it really works for them, they count their blessings every day, and other people think it's really trite and hokey, and they would never do it. And so it made me think about this idea that you really have to find the happiness strategy that fits your personality, and that's what's going to work better. Just like in a diet, for example, you want to find the diet that works best for you. And so fit is important, and so is motivation. So we did a study where we asked people to try to be grateful or optimistic, and then we had we looked at their changes in happiness over the course of this intervention. This was 8 weeks, and then the yellow bars were more motivated people. So we had participants who wanted to become happier, and then the orange bars are participants who really didn't care. I mean, it's not like they wanted to be unhappy, but they just didn't care about becoming happier. And so we found that people who were motivated to be happier, they actually benefited more from trying to be happier. I mean, maybe that's obvious, right? It's kind of like if you want to lose weight, you benefit more from a diet than if you don't really care. So motivation is important as well, as is fit. And so 2 more factors that we have looked at are the importance of personal activity, fit, and motivation when you try to pursue happiness. Another one is social support, right beneath that. And so I'm a runner, for example, and so when I wake up in the morning, I have like my workout clothes ready, and I have a friend that I meet on a street corner in Santa Monica where I live, and it's really early in the morning, and so when I wake up, the first thing I think is I don't want to do it, right? And so you don't want to go, but I have that buddy who I know would be really unhappy if I weren't at that street corner, right? Because she's thinking the same thing. When she wakes up, she doesn't want to go either. And so that kind of buddy or social support is really important in maintaining my habit of running. And I think the same thing for happiness, right? So we need social support, emotional support, or whatever to kind of help get us going. And so we did a study where we asked people to try to imagine themselves in the future and think about all their dreams coming true. And I call it it's like a visualizing your best possible self intervention, where you're trying to become more optimistic. And this was a 4-week intervention. And so and then we looked at people's happiness or positive emotions from before to after the intervention. And the blue line is the control group. And this, by the way, were students. And we often find that in student populations, over the course of a quarter or a semester, their happiness goes down. Does that make sense? It's like everyone starts off the quarter, or you guys in the semester system, right? You start off the semester like pretty gung-ho, right? Like new classes, but then as the semester proceeds, you have more work. The classes are sort of not as exciting as they were at the beginning. You have midterms, you have papers, and so everyone kind of gets a little less happy over time. So our control groups typically get less happy over time. But then people who tried to be optimistic throughout the study, they got happier, so that's the yellow bar. And then the students who had social support, so they had other students who were kind of like encouraging them, they got even happier. Okay, so having social support was important in sort of helping your self-improvement activity. Actually, in any kind of self-improvement activity, you want to have support from family, friends, or just sort of at least one buddy to kind of do it with. Something else we're interested in is culture. I mentioned culture at the very beginning of the talk, that there clearly are cultural differences in how people define happiness and how they pursue happiness. And so we've done a lot of studies cross-culturally. We have these collaborators at Seoul National University in Korea. And so we've done quite a few studies in Korea, and we compare Korean students to American students. And so this study that I'll tell you about briefly, we compared Seoul National University students to UC Riverside students, where I teach. And these students wrote gratitude letters every week, or they did acts of kindness every week over a period of 6 weeks. So it was a 6-week intervention. And it was really interesting what we found in this study, because it was kind of unexpected. So these are the results for the American students. And so these are line graphs. So when the line is going up, that means that these students are getting happier over time. And time 0 is right at the beginning of the intervention. Time 1 is 3 weeks into it, right in the middle. And time 2 is right at the end, right after it ends. It's 6 weeks. And so you see that students who wrote gratitude letters, which is the yellow line, they got happier. And students who did acts of kindness over time, they also got happier. And these are the American students. That's exactly what we would expect to find. But here's what we found with the Korean undergraduates. So the Korean students who wrote the Korean students who did acts of kindness, that's the kind of reddish bar line there, they got a little happier, but the Korean students who wrote gratitude letters actually got a little less happy in our study, which was so interesting. We had never found that before. And at the time, when we got these results, I actually was giving a talk for the Ministry of Education in Seoul, and so I asked people there, well, what can you make of these findings? And they said, well, in Korean culture, expressing gratitude is kind of a mixed experience, because when you express gratitude to someone, they feel indebted to you, and it might make you feel guilty when you acknowledge that someone else has helped you, and sometimes it's actually insulting to express gratitude. So for example, it's considered insulting to express gratitude to your parents, which I was really shocked to hear about, because of course my kids never expressed gratitude to me, and I would really love it if they did, but I would not consider it insulting, but they did. And the idea is that it's their duty to support their kids. It's almost like an insult to acknowledge, like as though they were considered doing something else. So anyway, we've actually found now in other studies with other cultures that gratitude can be a mixed experience. Sometimes it makes you feel happy, but other times it makes you feel guilty or indebted or even embarrassed. And in this study, we also found that, so that's the importance of culture. We also found that effort matters. So we coded, when people wrote gratitude letters or did acts of kindness, we wanted to see how much effort were people putting into it. Were they really taking this seriously? When they wrote their gratitude letters, were they long and detailed and sincere? And so you can see, and you can show this clearly, you can see this clearly in the US data. The students who put a lot of effort, the red lines, into their gratitude letters or their acts of kindness that they did, they got a lot happier. The students who put medium effort, the yellow lines, they got moderately happier, but the students who put low effort, which were the blue lines, they didn't get happier at all. So again, maybe an obvious finding, but it was important to show that. So there was the importance of effort in our studies. Okay, so this clicker has definitely slowed me down a bit. Okay, so I think I'm pretty much done telling you about our studies. The theme of our research is that happiness takes effort. I mean, it takes work. Just like with any goal in life, if you want to raise healthy, happy, moral children, if you want to succeed at your career, you need to put effort or work into it, right? It doesn't just come to you. If you want to, become more fit, you have to put work into it. Same thing with your emotional goals. I'm just going to skip some of this. So I want to end by telling you about a study that we did in Japan, where we're interested in not just sort of, all the studies I've told you about right now, up until now, we measure happiness by just asking people how happy they are. So it's just self-report. And I didn't really mention this before, but happiness is very subjective, right? So it's only you know whether you're happy and how happy you are. I mean, we could look at sort of how much you smile, or does your roommate or your mom think you're happy, but those are all kind of imperfect measures of happiness. But in addition to sort of asking people how happy do you feel, we also have used some behavioral measures to actually see do our interventions also influence people's behaviors? And so we've done studies where people wear what we call, they're kind of like name badges. Think of like a lanyard around your neck with a badge on it. But they're sociometric badges. And inside the badges, there are accelerometers like you would have in your phone. Like when you turn over your iPad or iPhone, the screen changes, and that's because of the accelerometer is sensing motion in 3 dimensions. And so we can see how much people are moving. And these badges also send infrared signals to one another, so we can see whether people are interacting with others and who they're interacting with. So it's kind of a cool measure of behavior. And so we did a study where people were wearing these badges, and we did it at a Japanese engineering company. And in this study, we asked people, this was a 6-week intervention, we asked these employees of this company to write down 3 things that went well at work each week for 6 weeks. Okay, so think about that. Each week for 6 weeks, write down 3 things that went well at work or at school. And then in the control group, we asked, write down 3 tasks that you completed, right? 3 tasks that you completed. So it's also kind of positive, but it's a little bit more neutral. And so what we found was the employees of this company who wrote down 3 things that went well at work each week, they got happier by self-report. They said that they were more connected to other people at work, and they also moved more. So literally, these badges they were wearing, they tracked their movements, and we found that they had more physical energy and they moved more around the office. And we also found that they left the office earlier, which we were a little worried about, that maybe like they were playing hooky more because they were so happy, you know, that they wanted to leave work. But actually in Japan, in Tokyo, people work incredibly long hours, and so actually know exactly how long they work because we had this study. And so they were leaving at about 10 or 11 p.m. as opposed to like 11:30 or 12 or midnight. So we actually think it's a positive thing that they left work earlier. So I think it's a cool new direction that we are studying where we're looking at how much our happiness interventions are actually influencing not just how people feel, their sense of well-being, but how much they're moving and how they're behaving. I want to conclude basically by saying that I think happiness is obviously, I think it's really important. That's what I've been studying for like 27 years. Happier people are more creative. They have better relationships. They're better leaders. They're healthier. And most people around the world say that they want to be happier. And so I kind of want to conclude by saying that it is important. It is possible to become happier. It's not easy. It takes a lot of work. It takes you have to take sort of the first step and then the second step, and you can help yourself be happier, and you can help others be happier. And I always like to end in the spirit of philosophy with a quote from Aristotle, who 2,000 years ago, I think he didn't exactly mean what I mean by this, but I'm kind of stolen his quote that I think kind of summarizes the gist of research from the science of happiness, which is that happiness depends upon ourselves. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions from the audience. We have 2 people down front with microphones. If you'll raise your hands, they'll come to you. We do ask that you have questions and not long statements or speeches, all right, so we can get more people participating.
Hello. I'm curious if there is collective happiness or if you've looked at kind of societal happiness in with this individual. Mm-hmm. It feels like sometimes there's big shifts or sways of greater happiness in society.
That's a really interesting question about collective happiness versus individual happiness. Of course, sometimes researchers will just measure individual happiness and they aggregate it and they take sort of the average or the sum, but that doesn't quite get, I think, at what your question is. And I don't really know because I only study individual happiness, but I know, like, just as an example, I was giving a talk once at the University of Chicago and I was talking about happiness, and there's a woman in the audience and she was from Israel, and she said, well, I don't understand how to answer this question about happiness. Because when I'm asked, like, are you happy, I kind of ask myself, well, is my country happy? Like, how is my country doing? And that's kind of her answer. So maybe that's sort of what you're getting at. It's sort of a very different way of thinking about what happiness is. So at best, I really don't know how to answer your question other than to say I think it's really fascinating and that someone should study it.
I'm curious about the 6-week period that so many of your studies took. How did you decide on the time frame?
Oh, why 6 weeks? Yeah, that's a good question too. So it might have been a coincidence that a lot of the studies I presented today were 6 weeks. They really range anywhere from 2 weeks to 12 weeks. So I think partly it's a manageable period of time. Like we don't want to make it too short because then it's not really A happiness intervention is more like a mood induction or something, right? It's like if you put someone on a diet for 1 week, it doesn't seem like that's long enough. So we feel that 6 weeks is sort of long enough, but it's not so long that it's still feasible for us to do a study if they're too long. And then also we don't want people to lose interest. So yeah, so it's not really a magic number, but it's what we tend to work with, 4 to 6, 8 weeks.
I'll try to be quick. I have 2 questions. One, what are your thoughts in terms of millennials and this thought of, there's conversations about entitlement, and there's the fact that I actually read a review on your book, and it goes along your presentation that happiness takes work. So where's that between like expectation of entitlement of like, I should be happy, but then there's no work? And the second part, which is a different question, is how would you go about fostering these in organizations and with our employees, especially when the values remains focused on making money, or that changing the carrot, I guess, to focus on happiness while controlling for performance and effectiveness?
Thank you. I think I understood your first one, but not the second one, but I'll start with the first one. Okay, so you're asking about millennials, right? And feelings of entitlement or having high expectations. And I think that's really interesting. I actually have a friend who's a personality psychologist at San Diego State. Her name is Jean Twenge, and she's wrote a book called Generation Me, and also the narcissism epidemic. And she talks about research that shows that that sort of teenagers and young people have become more narcissistic over time, over generations. And so I think that's similar to what you're saying, kind of a sense of entitlement or feeling like you deserve more, or you feel like you're entitled to things. So there's some debate about those data, although there's a lot of data showing kind of self-esteem and narcissism is going up. But I do think, I mentioned hedonic adaptation, which is this phenomenon, right, that we get used to what we have. And so we buy something, we get used to it, we want more. And so that can really spiral out of control. And so I guess kind of the idea that if you feel like you deserve things or you're entitled to things or you have high expectations, you won't be as happy, right? Because you'll always want something more and more and more. And I think the other question kind of touched on materialistic values, right? And so those are exactly the kind of values that again, without being judgmental about whether materialism is good or bad, I'll just tell you the research shows that materialism is associated with all kinds of adverse outcomes, right? So people who are materialistic are less happy, they're less grateful, they're just, they're more likely to be depressed. They have all kinds of problems, actually. And so it makes sense, though, that if you care more about possessions, that you're never really going to be happy, because every possession is going to make you want more and more, right? So you get one car, but it's not enough. Now you have the Series 3 BMW. Now you want the Series 6 BMW. And so so research suggests that those desires are harmful for well-being. Thank you.
Hi there, I have a question. So in relation to the random acts of kindness movement that's going on, have you seen in any studies, whether your own or others that you've looked into, the types of happiness that goes along with doing random acts of kindness for people that you don't know, instead of acts of kindness towards people that you do know, so your sister, your roommate, so on and so forth?
All right, thank you for that. So we have tried to look at that. We've never actually done a study where we manipulated like random versus non-random, but we do code, we read what people do. So we'll do studies where we ask people to do acts of kindness, and then we sort of see what they wrote that they did. And we've actually never found a difference in the well-being benefits between those groups, but it could be that we don't have enough sort of data yet. But I think one of the issues is that doing random acts of kindness gives you a certain kind of benefit. So when you kind of help strangers, it makes you feel good as a person. Like a lot, right? Because it's like, wow, I am so good that I would help a stranger with sort of expecting nothing in return. When you help friends and family, you don't have that benefit as much, but you have the benefit in terms of connection with that person. You might actually strengthen your relationship. And so both of those are benefits that are kind of competing with one another. You get different kinds of benefits. We actually find that connection is really important. And so helping people we know, I actually think is more powerful, because relationships really are one of the keys to happiness. And so we did a study, for example, I didn't mention it, where we asked people in one group, do acts of kindness for a particular person. In another group, we asked people to do acts of kindness for the world, which kind of is similar to what you're asking about, but it could be like collecting litter. I mean, it doesn't have to be for a stranger. It could be kind of more abstract. And we also had people do acts of kindness for themselves, which I thought was an interesting comparison. So you could treat yourself to a massage or a cookie or something. And then we had a control group where people just kind of organized their time. And we looked at their changes in their bodies. So we actually collected blood samples from before and after the study, and we found changes in RNA gene expression from before to after the intervention that showed that people who did acts of kindness for others actually showed kind of a more, an improved immune response that was mirrored in their RNA gene expression, which is like really, really cool. And I'm not a biologist, but I work with a biologist. But so that showed that there was like these unique benefits, there were physiological benefits when you help a particular person. So I think there's something special about that relationship that could be strengthened. So thank you for that question, because it allowed me to tell you about that cool study.
Thank you for sharing about the benefits about being happy. I would like to ask you, how you, maybe in a personal experience, how do you go about when you don't have a happy moment, or when it's one of those up and downs? How you go back to that place?
When you don't have a happy moment?
Like you are working on the happiness project, kinda. So I believe sometimes you are not happy all the time. So what do you do in those down moments?
So what do I personally do? Well, first of all, I'm certainly not advising myself or anyone to try to be happy all the time, right? So we know that we don't want to be happy all the time. I mean, all kinds of, we experience a range of emotions for a reason, and those emotions are functional and adaptive, right? So sometimes we need to be sad because it's a signal that something is wrong, and sometimes we need to be angry when we see injustice or things in the world that need to be fixed. But it's just when those emotions are chronic that they're not helpful. So. But in my own life, I mean, I think I'm a pretty happy person, but again, I'm certainly not happy all the time. And when you have 4 children, there's no way you could be happy all the time. So, but I think my work has kind of reminded me of what I can do to become happier. Actually, one of my favorite personal strategies that I didn't really talk much, well, I mentioned it today, is savoring. It's like just really like living more in the moment. Because, a lot of us here in this room, I'm sure, are like very busy, and we have all this work, schoolwork or work, or family, other obligations that we're constantly trying to juggle. And so it's hard to you're sort of moving from one task to another. But we only have one life, right, to live. And so, and life is short, right? So you kind of have to, these are cliches, but they're true. And so we want to sort of savor and enjoy the experiences that we do have between those tasks. And so I think I'm pretty good at reminding myself, like, okay, what I'm having dinner, even though like maybe I have some very stressful thing I need to do later, but I'm having dinner, I'm really gonna enjoy my dinner, whether it's alone or with a friend, or you know what I mean, to really savor that experience. So that's kind of like what I do is focus on savoring positive experiences. So.
You mentioned that people that are happier are healthier and more creative and have more friends than other people that are not that happy. And also knowing that happiness means different things within cultures. Within your research and studies, how do you, or what criteria do you use to define happiness or to measure happiness?
So we don't really have sort of criteria or threshold. We let our participants define happiness for themselves. So we basically ask people how happy they are, and there are many validated measures of happiness. Generally, happiness is measured by asking people, 1, is your life good? Are you satisfied with your life and how it's going? And 2, how often do you experience positive emotions and negative emotions? And happier people are more likely to be satisfied with their lives, thinking they're making progress towards their goals. And they experience more positive and more frequent positive emotions than do less happy people. So and we also will just ask people, how happy are you? And so we let people define happiness for themselves. And actually, it is really interesting. And I was telling Professor Pybus earlier that I'm involved in a project looking at philosophical views of happiness, of well-being. And there are many different perspectives on what happiness is, from kind of like flourishing and living your best life and contributing to society, to just having a lot of pleasure, to having a certain kind of set of desires fulfilled. And we can't really agree on what that is. So we have decided we're not gonna specify like a certain definition, and just, as I said, sort of which is, by the way, problematic in itself, is sort of to let people define happiness by themselves. So we can debate whether that's the right way to do it, but that's the decision that we made, is to let people define it themselves.
Hi. Here.
Yeah. Hi.
Doesn't it seem, though, that to some extent this definition of happiness, however vague it is, this idea of flourishing and living your best life, is a function of privilege to some extent? I mean, how do you control in these studies for class, for example, and race and gender identity and sexual orientation? I mean, things that have serious impacts on people's happiness that are really not determined by our attitudes or our own sense of gratitude. We are not always determinative of that individually.
And of course, these are important things that influence happiness. I mean, our studies are mostly experiments. Well, not mostly, they're all are experiments, the ones that I do. And so we randomly assign people to either, try to be more grateful or try to be more kind to others. And so their class and we tend to use fairly homogeneous samples, although we do use fairly different samples, so they're not all like privileged. And in fact, UC Riverside, where I teach, is not at all privileged kind of group, and one of the most diverse universities in the United States. So those kinds of effects cancel themselves out. I actually disagree with you, though, that our attitudes and how we think doesn't influence certain people. I think no matter what, I'm not saying like, oh, if you're poor and if you're in an abusive relationship and you live in a war zone, it doesn't matter, you can just think happy thoughts and you'll be happy. I'm certainly not saying that, but I think in many circumstances, research has shown that people who are, say, more invested in relationships and focus more on their baby and their partner, and are grateful for what they do have without necessarily accepting their fate, and have different and are motivated to change their life, like those people are happier. So I think in any kind of environment, there are individual differences in happiness, and some of those are explained by how we think and sort of what our attitude is. So I disagree with that, but there are plenty of other researchers that are doing work on and I think class is actually one of the most interesting topics. I came from a lower class, when I was little, and I've, moved in that, and I find that really fascinating, sort of differences. And I don't do research on it myself, but I find it very, very interesting. But again, I think those are all things that influence happiness, but I do also think that how people think and how they behave in their daily lives also greatly influence happiness.
We have time for one more question.
Have you been able to conduct any studies that generally, either quantitatively or qualitatively, distinguish between people who you would generally call religious, believe in a supreme being of some sort or another, and those who eschew that and deny such a supreme being, for example?
Thank you for that question. So that's a good one to end on. I don't do research on that topic myself, but lots of other people do. And the general I actually just saw a talk by David Myers, who's a professor at Hope College in Michigan, and he's one of the world's experts on religion and happiness, if you're interested. And so the general finding is that people who are religious or believe in God or who are spiritual are happier than those who are not. Now, there are a number of caveats to that. One of the keys to that seems to be a sense of community and strong families and communities and social support that people who are more religious have. And so if you're not religious, you can certainly have social support and strong community and family as well. And the other one is a sense of meaning in life that religious people report having more than people who are less religious. So that could be one of the reasons that they report more happiness. And these are obviously all correlational studies because you can't do experiments where you make, half of the people, believe in a supreme being and the other half not. So unfortunately for us scientists. But that's a really interesting topic of research, and I can point you to some papers or books about that. Thank you.
Let us think.
Thank you.